In the small village of Bethlehem, surrounded by peaceful hills and green pastures, Abishai, the first son of Zeruiah, was born. The house was simple, but full of stories. Zeruiah, David's sister, carried in her blood the strength and courage of a family destined to change the history of Israel. Abishai grew up alongside his two younger brothers, Joab, who always had a watchful eye, and Asahel, whose agility was admired by everyone. They were ordinary boys, running around the fields, competing with each other, but there was something different about Abishai. He had a sparkle in his eyes, an air of someone who knew that life had something bigger in store for him. While he was still little, Abishai heard the stories of David, the uncle who had faced the giant Goliath. These narratives were not just heroic tales for him, they were living inspirations. He grew up imagining the day when he too would hold a sword and face the enemies of God's people. During the afternoons, in the hills around the village, he trained alone, using tree branches as spears and stones as targets. His heart pounded at the thought of the call that somehow seemed inevitable. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. When the shepherds returned from the plains and talked about the battles against the Philistines, Abishai listened to each word carefully, capturing the details as if they were fragments of an already planned destiny. He didn't know when or how, but something inside him told him that the future would take him far beyond the fields of Bethlehem. And the moment didn't take long to arrive. That was when his uncle, the now escaped David, began to gather courageous men to follow by his side. Abishai knew his time had come. Without hesitation, he left the tranquility of the village to follow his call. Abishai was no longer the boy who trained with branches in the fields of Bethlehem. Now, with sword in hand and heart inflamed with courage, he was at David's side among men that the world called misfits, but that God transformed in warriors. Each brought a story of defeat, pain, or rejection, but together they were the strength that would protect Israel's chosen one. For Abishai, being there was not just a matter of following his uncle. He felt that this mission, no matter how dangerous it was part of the greater plan that he always sought to understand. It was on one of these nights, amidst Saul's fatigue and constant persecution, that Abishai received the first great test of his loyalty and bravery. David, ever vigilant, noticed that Saul's army had set up camp on the nearby hills. A bold mission began to be designed. The idea was to sneak into the enemy camp at night, like shadows among the sleeping tents. The risk was immense, but David knew he needed to test those by his side. For Abishai, there was no hesitation. He immediately offered to accompany him. As the two silently crossed the rocky terrain under the cold glow of the stars, Abishai's heart beat not with fear, but with a strange exhilaration. As they approached the tents, they saw Saul, the man who pursued David so furiously, sleeping next to his spear stuck in the ground. It was a unique chance. With his eyes fixed on the sleeping king, Abishai whispered, "Let me pierce him with one spear. I won't need a second chance." His voice was firm, without tremors, as if he had already decided the fate of the man before him. But David, with a calm gesture, stopped his hand. That wouldn't be how things would happen. At that moment, something began to change in Abishai. He began to understand that bravery was not just a matter of sword and strength. The days at David's side transformed Abishai from a brave young man into a legendary warrior. It wasn't just about the strength he possessed or the skill he demonstrated with the sword. It was something deeper, a combination of unbreakable loyalty and a determination that pushed him forward where many would hesitate. Between battles and escapes, David observed his nephew and saw in him a natural leader, someone who, over time, would become one of the pillars of his army. It was during one of the many campaigns against the Philistines that Abishai unquestionably distinguished himself. David, now surrounded by a group of warriors who were beginning to be known as his mighty men, led daring raids against Israel's enemies. In one of these battles, Abishai found himself surrounded by an impressive number of enemy soldiers. Some say there were 300 men. For anyone else, it would be a certain defeat scenario. But Abishai was not like the others. Wielding his spear, he charged forward like a storm, facing his enemies with a fury that seemed out of this world. The movements were fast, almost like a dance, each blow leaving deep marks on the battlefield. The screams of his enemies echoed as he, alone, turned the tide of a confrontation that seemed lost. It wasn't just strength, it was strategy, precision, and a courage that made the men around him believe that nothing could stop him. When the last enemy fell, the field was silent, except for the sound of Abishai's heavy breathing and the admiring murmurs of those watching the scene. It was on that day that he was recognized as leader of the 30, a group of warriors whose name would be remembered for generations. But for Abishai, the battle was not about glory or recognition. He knew this was just the beginning. There was still much to be done, many battles to fight and many lives to protect, and above all, he knew that his most important mission was yet to come. The battles continued, and with them, Abishai's reputation grew. Each confrontation brought new stories about his strength and courage, but none of them would be as memorable as the day he saved David's life. The king, although experienced and brave, was no longer the young shepherd who faced Goliath. The weight of years and responsibilities had begun to take its toll. Even so, he still led his army, marching ahead as he did in the times when he was just a fugitive. In one of these battles, the Philistines, determined to defeat Israel once and for all, brought one of their most fearsome warriors to the battlefield, Ishbi-Benob, a descendant of the giants. He was a colossal man, carrying a spear whose tip was so heavy that few could even lift it. He charged across the battlefield like a gale, striking down anyone who dared cross his path, and then his eyes fell on David. Abishai, fighting nearby, saw the giant advance toward the king. David, exhausted, tried to defend himself, but the enemy's blow was too strong, and the situation seemed to get out of control. Abishai's heart skipped a beat. It was as if time had stopped at that moment. He didn't think, just acted. With spear in hand, he ran towards the giant, releasing a scream that echoed across the battlefield. The clash was fierce. The giant, confident in his strength, did not see Abishai as a real threat. But Judah's warrior was fast and precise. With a well-aimed movement, he hit the giant, knocking him down impressively. The field was silent for a moment as the men of Israel processed what they had just witnessed. David, still standing thanks to Abishai's intervention, looked at his nephew with gratitude and something more, deep respect. But that day's victory did not bring complete relief. It was just a reminder that the threats against the people of Israel continued to grow, and that the challenges ahead would be even greater. The scars of the battle against Ishbi-Benob were still fresh when a new threat befell David and his men. This time, it wasn't just a matter of swords and spears, but something even more cruel. While in Ziklag, the city that served as their refuge, Abishai and David's warriors returned from a campaign to find a desolate scene. The city had been sacked by the Amalekites. The houses were in ruins, the silence was heavy, and what broke the heart most was the absence of their families. Women, children, everyone had been taken prisoner. Desperation took over the group. Strong men, accustomed to the battlefield, cried like children. Even David, the leader who never showed weakness, seemed to sink under the weight of that tragedy. In the midst of this, Abishai remained firm. He knew there was no time for prolonged lamentation. If they wanted to save their families, they would need to act quickly. Every second lost increased the distance between them and the Amalekites. David sought God's direction, and with the clear answer that they should pursue their enemies, the march began. They were difficult days. The scorching heat of the desert, thirst and fatigue tested each man's limits. Many began to weaken, But Abishai continued ahead, encouraging others with his unwavering strength. He knew they couldn't afford to give up. It was their families' lives that were at stake. When they finally reached the Amalekites' camp, the scene was one of celebration among the looters. The enemy, confident that they would not be followed, celebrated their victory. Abishai, alongside David, did not wait for long speeches or elaborate plans. The attack was swift and devastating. He led the charge with a fury that seemed to consume everything around him, charging like a lion in defense of his prey. And so, in the midst of that chaotic battle, each family began to recover, but something inside Abishai told him that that moment did not mark the end of his challenges. Victories brought temporary relief, but life with David was never peaceful. Even with external enemies constantly lurking, internal conflicts began to become even more dangerous. Time revealed a wound that David never imagined carrying: the rebellion of his own son, Absalom. For Abishai, there was no doubt which side he would be on. From the beginning, he stood firmly by the king's side, willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the man who had led Israel in so many battles, and who, to him, was much more than an uncle. He was God's anointed. When Absalom declared himself king and raised an army against David, the situation became critical. David, accompanied by his loyalists, was forced to flee Jerusalem. While many hesitated, confused by the betrayal, Abishai did not waver. During the long marches and freezing nights of exile, he walked alongside David, alert for any threat. With every step, he seemed to carry not only his own sword, but also the weight of the hopes of all who remained faithful. It was during one of these escapes that a man named Shimei appeared on the path, cursing David and throwing stones at him. Many in the group were outraged, but none more so than Abishai. His eyes flashed with anger as he drew his sword and said, "Why would this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me pass and I will cut off his head." His words were full of determination, but David once again intervened, asking for calm. Abishai was reluctant but obeyed, learning, albeit reluctantly, another lesson about patience and controlling one's own momentum. The journey was long, but the news of the war that was brewing gave no rest. Absalom was gathering a large army, and David would have to face him soon. As Abishai buckled his armor and readied his weapons, he knew that the coming battle would be more than a physical confrontation. It would be a duel between duty and blood. The battle against Absalom was fierce, marked by the pain of a father and the loyalty of men like Abishai. The confrontation took place in a dense forest in Ephraim, where the treacherous terrain seemed to conspire against the rebels. The tall trees blocked the sun, and the exposed roots were natural traps for the unsuspecting. Abishai, alongside his brother Joab, led one of David's army detachments, determined to crush the revolt and restore order. Despite the chaos of the combat, Abishai's heart was divided. He knew that Absalom was more than an enemy. He was the son of the man they swore to protect. David had made it clear that he wanted to spare Absalom's life, but in the heat of battle, following this order seemed impossible. The young rebel, in his attempt to escape, ended up trapped by his hair in the branches of a tree, leaving him at the mercy of the soldiers. Abishai was not present at the exact moment, but when he heard what had happened, a mixture of relief and concern came over him. Absalom's fate was already out of his hands. After the victory, the army returned with the bitter feeling of having triumphed at the cost of the king's suffering. David wept inconsolably for his lost son, and Abishai, watching from afar, felt the weight of his loyalty once again. But the war left no room for prolonged mourning. Soon another threat arose, this time in the figure of Sheba, a man who incited a new rebellion against David. Peace always seemed a distant dream for Israel. David ordered Sheba to be detained at any cost, and once again Abishai took the lead. He gathered his men and set off in pursuit, leading the army with the same determination he always carried. The persecution of Sheba was swift and relentless. Abishai led his men with almost supernatural precision. guided by his experience in countless battles and the urgency to prevent further chaos from taking over Israel. Sheba the rebel had fled to a fortified city called Abel-Beth-Maachah, where he hoped to hide behind high walls and reinforced gates. But Abishai was not the type to give up when faced with obstacles. Upon arriving at the city, he immediately ordered a siege. The soldiers began to build ramps and prepare battering rams, while Abishai watched everything with attentive eyes. For him, each move was a piece in a larger game. However, something unexpected happened. A wise woman from the city appeared on the walls and called out to Abishai. In a firm voice, she questioned why Israel would destroy a city that had always been loyal to the kingdom. Abishai, even in the heat of the mission, had the wisdom to listen. He explained that he did not seek the destruction of the city, but only Sheba, the man who had rebelled against the king. The woman's response was direct and practical. She would guarantee that Sheba's head would be delivered to him. Within a short time, the promise was fulfilled. The rebellion ended without any more blood being shed, and Abishai returned triumphant. But as the men celebrated their success, an old ghost from the past rose to haunt him again. Joab, his brother, had also followed the mission, and Joab, with his merciless nature, always found a way to do things his way. When Amasa, a man recently appointed commander of the army by David, appeared on the way, Joab wasted no time. Using cunning, he coldly murdered him, claiming it was for the good of the kingdom. Abishai saw the scene with dark eyes. He knew Joab was both a brother and a dangerous enigma. Joab's actions brought results, but always with a price. The years passed, and Abishai continued to be a pillar in David's army, but the battles never seemed to stop. The Philistines, Israel's ancient enemies, rose once again with renewed strength, bringing with them legendary warriors, descendants of the giants who had once terrorized the people. It was as if the land of Canaan itself still carried the shadows of Goliath and his lineage. This time, the threats were more numerous and more ferocious. Among these giants was another formidable adversary, a man whose strength and size seemed to defy logic. He was a symbol of the Philistines' power and came straight to where the Israelites feared most, the heart of the army. Abishai was there, firm as always, but what worried him was David. The king, still brave, insisted on fighting alongside his men despite his advanced age. He didn't want to be a distant war king, but his strength was no longer the same. In the midst of the battle, David found himself face to face with the giant. Abishai's eyes fixed on that scene as if time had slowed down. The king, despite his bravery, was being weighed down by the weight of the fight. Every blow he exchanged with the giant was a reminder that his glory years on the battlefield were behind him. That was when the enemy advanced with full force, about to deliver the final blow. Abishai didn't think twice. With a shout that seemed to echo throughout the field, he rushed towards the giant, raising his sword with a determination that could not be measured. The battle between the two was brief but fierce. With a well-aimed blow, Abishai knocked down the giant, saving David's life once again. But that moment brought a heavy silence among the warriors. Many began to whisper that David should no longer expose himself to the danger of battle. As the army of Israel celebrated their victory, Abishai looked at David, knowing that this battle was a milestone, not just for the king, but for himself. Abishai's days on the battlefield began to dwindle, but his presence remained as a fortress for David and the entire army of Israel. He was still the respected leader of the 30, those elite warriors who carried the stories of courage and sacrifice on the front lines. His conquests were not just about military victories, but about loyalty, honor, and the never-ending quest to protect God's chosen kingdom. But like all things in life, even Abishai's strength would face the passage of time. Battles were now rarer, but never less important. Israel had conquered territories, defeated enemies, and become a feared and respected nation. However, in Abishai's heart, something worried him. He knew that David would not rule forever, and that the transition of the throne would be a critical moment for the kingdom. He carefully observed every move, every decision of the king and his potential successors. Abishai's loyalty was not just to one man, but to God's promise to Israel. It kept him grounded, even when uncertainties loomed like shadows around him. Little is known about Abishai's last days. The scriptures do not narrate his end, but it is as if his absence from the account is a silent reminder that even the greatest heroes leave the stage when the right time arrives. Yet his story echoed among the warriors who continued to protect Israel. Like a flame that never goes out, Abishai lived to serve, fight, and protect what he believed in, and his entire life was a testimony of courage and fidelity. The winds of change continued to blow over Israel, bringing new challenges and lessons. But as we look back at the path Abishai forged with his sword and his heart, the marks of his choices still serve as guides for those who come after. After all, each battle, each sacrifice teaches us something about who we are and what is really worth fighting for. The story of Abishai is like a river that runs through mountains and valleys, always moving forward, leaving deep marks wherever it goes. He never sought the spotlight, never fought for fame or personal glory. His life was dedicated to something greater, the protection of his king, his people, and God's promise to Israel. Every battle he faced, every difficult decision he made was guided by an unwavering faith and a sense of duty that few can understand. Abishai teaches us about loyalty in a world full of uncertainty. He was by David's side in his darkest moments, when everyone seemed to abandon the king. No matter the size of the challenge or the personal cost, he was always there, ready to act, fight, and protect. His life shows us that true greatness is not just in the victories we achieve, but in the commitment to what really matters. We also learn from Abishai about courage. Not the arrogant courage that seeks to prove something, but the humble courage that faces the impossible because it knows there is something greater at stake. Whether facing an army of 300 men, a giant, or the pains of internal conflict, Abishai never backed down. He was living proof that, with determination and trust in God, we can overcome even the greatest giants in life. Finally, Abishai teaches us about service. He never used his position as leader of the 30 for his own benefit. Instead, he led by example, always willing to be the first to advance and the last to retreat. His story is a reminder that true power is not in governing but in serving. And so Abishai's footprints remain etched in Israel's history, not just as a warrior, but as a man who dedicated his life to a greater purpose. A purpose that still inspires us today, to live with courage, fidelity, and faith in the face of our challenges. If you liked Abishai's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.